Hello, everybody. Welcome. So it's been said that the surest way to hit a home run is to be born on third base. And I found myself on third base when I inherited the T32 training program from John Grabowski less than a year ago. John wrote the grant, obtained it on his first submission to NIH, no less, and that's saying something. And I would also add, though, that whether you inherit or you build, you need a lot of luck if you're going to be successful. And this T32 training program has been very lucky in the trainees that we've been able to recruit. And you'll be hearing today from three of the four of our first cohort in the trainee program. With minimal input from myself and other program elders, this cohort really self-organized into a coherent academic and really collaborative community. Not only have they each individually been highly successful, they've also been different from and greater than the sum of their parts in the way that they've been able to work together. Today you'll hear a presentation from these trainees, and I think it will highlight the synergy, because I think this presentation might not have come from any one of these individuals, but emerged from this group together. So just a few words first about the presenters. Justin Anker will be presenting. Justin was the first trainee in the first cohort of the program. He received his PhD in cognitive and behavioral psychology under the tutelage of Marilyn Carroll. His early work employed animal models to identify biological and behavioral factors associated with the vulnerability to and recovery from substance use disorders. After obtaining his PhD, he took a turn toward the more clinical, working at Hazelden Betty Ford and teaching and also doing program evaluation. As a postdoc in the program, Justin worked with me and others looking at drinking motivations and alcohol, especially drinking to cope and how it related to negative affect in addiction. In this work, Justin became largely self-taught in the complex technique of network analysis. Justin has produced high-profile publications in this area, presented on the national stage, and finds himself currently in a group of international and national experts in this area. Since joining our faculty as an assistant professor quite recently, Justin has received an NIAAA K01 award. He's going to develop translational models that combine biological, cognitive, and behavioral methods to better understand comorbidity and relapse. Another of our presenters today will be Mary Forbes. Mary received her PhD in 2014 from Macquarie. Am I saying that right, Mary? Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, where she hails from. There she studied the empirical structure of psychopathology. And this agenda seeks to recast the problem of diagnostic comorbidity as a problem of misguided psychopathology taxonomy. So, for example, Mary and her colleagues have found that the high degree of covariance between presumably distinct psychopathology diagnostic categories calls into question the meaningfulness of these diagnostic boundaries. Since joining the T32, Mary has continued to work using latent variable modeling to probe the nature of comorbidity and to refine psychopathology taxonomy. In the T32, Mary has published extensively in high-impact journals. She's presented nationally and internationally and has established herself at a very early point in her career as an international expert on statistical modeling of psychopathology. Mary will be the last of the first cohort in the T32 training program to graduate this July, and she'll be returning to her native Australia, where she'll start as the equivalent of a new assistant professor. Last presenter, but certainly not least, is Sofia Albert. Sophia recently completed the T32 postdoc and now is an assistant professor in our department. Sophia investigates novel treatments and their implications for the neurobiology of PTSD and depression. Her work as a trainee showed that serial ketamine infusions result in striking symptom reduction in this difficult-to-treat population. Not being satisfied with just providing an important clinical discovery, Sophia is now proposing a grant to leverage the ketamine effect to study the underlying pathophysiology of PTSD and depression. In addition to pharmacologic manipulations, Sophia is also applying electrical and magnetic neuromodulation to the problem of treatment-resistant depression. With that introduction, I'll turn things over to our speakers as they present a talk entitled Beyond Diathesis-Stress, Differential Susceptibility via Childhood Adversity in a Nationally Represented Sample of Adults. Please join me in welcoming Justin, Miri, and Sophia.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that really warm and thoughtful welcome. So our group, as Matt mentioned, is from a NIDA T32 fellowship, the title of which is Comorbidity, Substance Use Disorders, and Other Psychiatric Conditions. And a primary objective of this fellowship is to provide trainees with working knowledge of comorbidity research and foster transdisciplinary collaboration. Our group project is our way of addressing that objective of the T32 fellowship, an actual research project. So we bring to the project different areas of expertise, which we found really interesting and valuable, and it's been a pleasure to work with everyone and learn from everyone. It's Miriam and Sophia. The introduction. Exposure to environmental adversity, stressful life events, is a primary vulnerability factor in the development of psychiatric disorders. It's been shown time and time again throughout the literature. One of the more popular models that most people are aware of is the Diathesis-Stress Model, which has guided a majority of the research examining the effects of environmental stress on the development of psychopathology. Now, according to the Diathesis-Stress Model, some individuals are more vulnerable to the environmental stressors owing to behavioral, physiologic, or genetic predispositions, or diatheses, or a diathesis. And due to their heightened sensitivity to stress, these individuals are more likely to manifest psychiatric conditions. So childhood adversity has been examined within the context of the Diathesis-Stress Model. And the stress sensitization hypothesis, a version of the Diathesis-Stress Model, posits that exposure to childhood adversity acts as a diathesis that can permanently sensitize individuals to stress as an adult, which in turn increases the likelihood of adult psychopathology. The stress sensitization hypothesis was examined by McLaughlin et al. 2014, who analyzed data from a nationally representative survey, the National Epidemiological Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, the same survey that we analyzed data from. And this group examined whether the association between past year stressful life events and 12-month prevalence of psychiatric disorders varied by the number of childhood adversities experienced by the participants while they were children. The results of McLaughlin et al. 2014 shown that past year stressful life events were associated with an increased risk for major depression and PTSD, and that childhood adversity moderated this association. So participants who were experienced, as shown here with the triangles, participants who experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experiences and 3 or more stressful life events are at an increased risk to develop MDD and PTSD compared to participants who experience 2 or fewer adversities during childhood or 2 or fewer stressful life events. The McLaughlin findings support other studies within the NESARC data sample, and these studies demonstrate, as did McLaughlin's, that childhood adversity serves as a diathesis with respect to the association between adult stress and adult psychopathology. So going back to the Diathesis-Stress Model, this view shows that some people are especially susceptible to adverse environments because of personal vulnerabilities. for example, those who experience childhood adversity, while others lacking vulnerability are resilient to negative environmental influences. Implicit in the Diathesis-Stress framework is the view that vulnerable and resilient individuals will respond similarly in positive environments and will differ only under conditions of environmental stress. So one consequence of this assumption is that many studies adopting this framework have not examined whether vulnerable and resilient individuals differ with respect to positive environments. The Differential Susceptibility model extends the Diathesis-Stress model by emphasizing that individuals differ in susceptibility to both negative and positive environments. So for example, individuals with low to no susceptibility are hypothesized to have fixed outcomes regardless of the environment they're in, either positive or negative. While individuals with higher environmental susceptibility or sensitivity will be more malleable to their environment for better or for worse. Similar to the Diathesis-Stress model, these individuals with high susceptibility will have worse outcomes in negative or stressful environments. However, in contrast to the Diathesis-Stress model, individuals with high susceptibility will be have more favorable outcomes in positive environments. Individuals with more malleability will respond for better, and some individuals with more malleability will respond for better and for worse depending on their environment. This model has been supported by a number of studies, particularly focused on childhood or adolescence when plasticity and environmental malleability is at its highest. This brings us to the T32 project objectives. So nearly all NESARC studies examining the relationship between childhood adversity, adult stress, and adult psychopathology do so within a Diathesis-Stress framework. Our primary objective was to examine phenotypic evidence for differential susceptibility in this data set. And to meet this objective, we operationalized positive and negative environment and health outcomes in terms of positive and negative adult change in stress and adult change in psychopathology, respectively. An additional objective was to determine whether positive childhood experience acts as a buffer against adult stress and adult psychopathology, which has received little attention within the literature. Previous work examining relationships between childhood adversity, adult stress, and adult psychopathology focus on specific psychiatric disorders, both internalizing or externalizing. So another objective of this study was to utilize a transdiagnostic approach to examine differential susceptibility across a spectrum of psychiatric disorders. As mentioned, we use the National Epidemiological Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions for data analysis. I'm just going to give a brief background on its purpose and design. This is the first survey that was designed, it was a survey designed and sponsored by the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. It's considered one of the largest at its time studies ever conducted on the co-occurrence of psychiatric disorders in the US. It's the first epidemiological survey to use DSM-4 definitions of mood and anxiety disorders. And it's been used extensively and cited the data set's been used extensively in the literature, resulting in over 850 publications. The objectives of the NESARC study were to examine the prevalence of psychiatric disorders, both lifetime and 12-month, as well as their risk factors and consequences. And additionally, to estimate the changes in prevalence rates over time between wave 1 and wave 2 3 years later. As mentioned, this is a nationally representative sample of US adults. They sampled individuals who were 18 plus years, and they interviewed them between 2001 and 2002, and then again between 2004 and 2005. The target population included non-institutionalized individuals and households, and African Americans, Hispanics, and young adults aged 18 to 24 were oversampled. The first wave included 43,093 participants with a response rate of 81%, and the second wave included 34,653 participants. These are all from the original sample with a response rate of 87%. going to go over the demographics for the current study. Now, these are demographics for the study sample that were used in our analyses. And just showing that there are similar proportions between males and females and similar proportions between white and non-white individuals. Ages were what you would expect, considering that there's 3 years apart in terms of the waves. Education status, college versus no college, and living arrangement. Living with a partner versus living alone was also similar between wave 1 and wave 2. The prevalence of DSM-4 diagnoses was also similar between waves. The disorder prevalence was associated with 12-month disorder endorsement. This leads us to the data analysis section of the talk and Dr. Miriam Forbes.
Got a long way to go there. Please raise your hand if I lose you going through these results at all, just so we can clarify as we go. So to reiterate, as Justin introduced, our research question was essentially to ask, does the relationship between changes in stress and changes in psychopathology, which is how we're conceptualizing sensitivity to the environment, when we observe that relationship in adulthood, does it vary as a function of childhood environment, including both adversity and positive childhood factors? So to get at this question, the thing that we did that's quite different from what past research has done is that we focused on looking at change over time, rather than looking at level of stress and level of psychopathology, how they're related, which is what past research has focused on in the Diathesis-Stress framework. We focused on how did stress change between the two waves and what was the corresponding change in psychopathology. So here our independent variable in our analyses is change in stress. And to operationalize stress at each wave, we looked at minor stresses, which included legal troubles, changes in housing, work troubles and job changes, and relationship problems. We also had major stresses, which included death of a loved one, being fired, laid off, or being unemployed, getting divorced or separated, and experiencing a financial crisis. And we included proximal trauma, which was in the 3 years before wave 1 and between wave 1 and wave 2, depending on which wave we were looking at. And these were the same variables that were looked at for stresses in the McLaughlin paper that Justin was talking about, which is what inspired us to select them. So to operationalize stress, we used a latent variable to look at the overlap among minor stresses, major stresses, and proximal trauma. And that allowed us to look at stress on a continuous dimensional scale. So that, for example, in our up here, we've got 0 is the mean level of stress in the population, and then these are standard deviations away from the mean. It's just a classic normal distribution. So at each wave, we represented stress on that continuous scale from low to high. So we fit this structural equation model at wave 2, which is where trauma was assessed, and it fit okay. It was a good conceptualization of the underlying relationships. And then we fit that identical model at wave 1, and it fit well again. And that was important so that we knew we were measuring stress in the same way at both of the waves.
How do you quantify, or how you total up the stress score? So how did you weight, for example, the minor and the major?
Yeah, so that's why we chose I should have put my factor loadings on the slide. Oh, can I repeat the question? Sure. So Dr. Limmer asked, how did we weight minor stress, major stress, proximal trauma in calculating the stress variable? And I should have put my factor loadings on my slide. So that was driven by the relationships in the data. So it was based on the extent to which minor stress, major stress, and proximal trauma tapped into a shared construct of stress at that time. And off the top of my head, I don't know what they are, but I'd be happy to send them to you. So we had stress measured the same way at both waves. And then, as I mentioned, what we were interested in was change in stress. So we computed the difference in this latent variable at the two waves so that negative values below 0 meant that stress decreased over time, and values above 0 meant that stress increased over time. And the units that we're looking at that change in is in standard deviations in the population. So that's an important thing to get your head around as we go through the results that we're looking at change scores specifically. We did the same sort of approach, looking at change in level of psychopathology in the sample that we had. So here we used a fear, distress, and externalizing model, which is a well-established structural equation model of the structure of psychopathology, particularly in NESARC, where fear represents phobic anxiety, including panic and agoraphobia, social phobia, and specific phobia. Distress includes major depression, dysthymia, generalized anxiety, and we also included the mental health functioning scale of the short form 12, and that was so that we could operationalize the more positive ends of psychopathology, where people can talk about feeling relaxed and feeling calm, not just the presence of psychopathology. And then we had externalizing, which includes antisocial personality disorder and a variety of substance use, abuse, and dependence disorders. And so, again, what we did was we took the overlap among these three groups of disorders to represent people's level of psychopathology in a broad sense, in this transdiagnostic way of capturing what is the overall severity of someone's presenting psychopathology. And we did the same thing. So here, our latent variable of psychopathology represents people's severity level on a continuous scale, and we fit this model at wave 1 and it fit well, and then we fit the identical model at wave 2 to make sure that psychopathology meant the same thing at both waves. And then we calculated the difference score between them so that, again, negative values meant that psychopathology had decreased between the two waves and positive values meant that it had increased. In all of our analyses, we controlled for these sociodemographic covariates, including age, sex, race, and ethnicity, which was unfortunately coded as white and not white. One of the things that I'll mention later is that we want to do more sophisticated analyses before we publish these data, but this is our first pass at the analyses to get at our research question. Whether people were married or living with a partner or not, whether they were in paid employment, had college education, and their personal income each year. So everything controls for those individual sociodemographic characteristics. So then remember that our question is, how does change in stress predict change in psychopathology contingent on childhood experiences? So our two potential moderators that we were interested in looking at, the first one was childhood adversity. And again, we took this list from the McLaughlin way of operationalizing childhood adversity. So these are all experiences before age 18. So a traumatic event that resulted in PTSD symptoms, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, family violence, neglect, endangerment, and parental dysfunction in the forms of parental severe mental illness, parental incarceration, and parental substance abuse. And so we looked at the number of types of childhood adversity that people had experienced in this list. And in our sample, this is the distribution that we had of how people fell into our 0, 1 to 2, and 3 plus characteristics. So here you can see that around 45, a bit less than half of the sample had experienced none of those events. About a third of the sample had experienced 1 to 2, and 20% had experienced 3 or more. So quite high levels, like a quite high proportion of just a representative population sample had experienced 3 or more of these types of childhood adversity. The other potential moderator that we looked at was the experience of positive childhood, which is something that hasn't been examined in the literature to date in this sort of framework. And this positive childhood variable included having someone in the person's family who wanted them to be a success, someone who helped them to feel that they were important or special, that they were part of a close-knit family, having someone who was a source of strength and support, and someone who believed in them. And we looked at whether they had none of these, some of these, or all of these. And that was so that we were mirroring our childhood adversity variable. So here we've got a bit of a different distribution. More like, this looks like 7% maybe had none of those experiences. About a quarter of the sample had 1 to 4, and close to 2/3 of the sample had all of those experiences of positive childhood. And this is interesting because it tells us that we're not finding the same groups in our childhood adversity and in our positive childhood factors, so that some of the people who had all of these positive childhood factors also experienced potentially high levels of childhood adversity. So jumping straight into the results, I'll give you the responsible presentation of the results first. So these are the key results we're going to look at today. Unfortunately, my Excel skills do not extend to putting individual error bars on each data point in a graph, and I could not figure out how to do it. So I wanted to show you this because we have our confidence intervals of our effect sizes and our significance levels. And what we're going to focus on here is our childhood adversity and positive childhood moderation effects, which were both significant in our analyses. So to orient you to, again, thinking about these in terms of change scores, we've got here we're going to look at stress and psychopathology. And I should probably have written on this slide change in stress and change in psychopathology, because that's what we're really getting at here. So on our x-axis, we have changes in stress. And remember that negative values are good, positive values are bad, right? That's increasing stress is as people move up this way, they had increasing stress between the two waves. And then down here, people had decreasing stress between the two waves. And then on our y-axis, we have change in psychopathology with the same thing. So here we've got decreases in psychopathology, increases in psychopathology, and both of the axes are in units of standard deviations based on that latent variable setup that we had. So before we take into account other variables in this relationship, this is our relationship between stress and psychopathology. And so basically we've got about, for each standard deviation increase in stress, we have about 1/5 of a standard deviation increase in psychopathology on average for our whole population. Any questions yet? No? Okay. Now we're going to jump into interactions, so let me know if I lose you. So now we're going to look at that same relationship, but contingent on those childhood adversity groups. So initially, we've got people who experience no childhood adversity, people who experienced 1 to 2, and people who experience 3 or more childhood adversity experiences or events. And what we see is that we have a stronger relationship between changes in stress and changes in psychopathology for people who experience more childhood adversity, and a weaker relationship for people who experience no or less childhood adversity, right? So that it's this continual increase in slope, and that's where our significant interaction effect comes from. And this, although it may not immediately be evident, is a differential susceptibility result. And I think it's easier to see that if we flip our axes. So I'm going to reorient you to the way that we're presenting this. So here we've got childhood adversity. We're going to be comparing people based on their childhood adversity experiences on the x-axis. And again, we've got psychopathology here. Now we're going to stratify people by their changes in stress between waves. So again, we've got decreasing, increasing. So to start with, if we look at people who had no change in stress, okay, so this is looking at no change in stress and remembering that we're controlling for all of the covariates. So when I say that it's just people who had no change in stress, it's a statistical effect, but that's getting unnecessarily technical. So if we look at this line here, this is comparing the people who had no change in stress, who experienced no childhood adversity, 1 to 2 types of childhood adversity, and 3 or more types of childhood adversity. And pretty consistently, we see that no change in stress corresponds with very little change in psychopathology, as we would expect. As we increase the levels of stress in the people that we're looking at, holding other things constant, what we see is that the relationship between changes in stress and changes in psychopathology is stronger for people who have higher levels of childhood adversity. So that here we're seeing a bigger increase in psychopathology in response to the same level of stress along this line, right? So this is 3 standard deviations. This is a big increase in stress compared to people who had no childhood adversity. That's our interaction effect here. So a bigger increase in this group compared to this group, for example. What's really interesting and where we see differential susceptibility instead of just diathesis-stress is if we look at improvements in the environment as well, decreases in stress. So here what we see is that people who had big decreases in stress as their environment got better, the people who had experienced the most childhood adversity had the biggest decreases in psychopathology as well. Their psychopathology decreased more in this environment compared to people who had no experiences of childhood adversity.
And so in other words, the -3 standard deviations would represent about 2% of the population.
Yes, it's even smaller than that. It's a tiny group, yeah. But I think that so this is the same data as we saw on the previous slide, but just flipping the axes so that we're stratifying people by their level of stress. But it's exactly the same data points that were represented in the previous graph. I just like it here because I think that this fanning out illustrates that idea that we've got more sensitivity to the environment. We're seeing bigger changes in response to the environment in this group, particularly compared to in this group, people who did not experience childhood adversity. So this is an illustration high levels of childhood adversity as a differential susceptibility factor. So then the other moderator that we looked at was the experiences of positive childhood. So here we're flipping back to having our stress on the bottom and our change in psychopathology on the y-axis, so the original presentation of the data, to again just compare the slopes of these lines. So here we've got the absence of positive childhood factors, 1 to 4, some positive childhood factors, and all of the positive childhood factors. And again, we see a significant moderation, a significant interaction effect where the slopes of these lines differ, and the relationship is weaker for people who experienced high levels of childhood support. And again, I think that it's easier for me to visualize these data when we flip the axes back around. So here we're going back again to comparing people on their positive childhood factors, so none, some, and all, and we're going to stratify them by their change in stress between waves over here. So we see a similar sort of result for no change in stress, not much change in psychopathology for any of the groups. And again, as we move up to increasingly large increases in stress between the two waves, we see a stronger effect in the people who had no positive childhood factors compared to people who had highly positive childhood experiences. And so again, we've got a bigger increase in psychopathology in response to the same increases in stress for the people who had no positive childhood compared to the people who had highly positive childhood. But it's a slightly different result as we look at the positive results. So here we don't see that fanning out at the bottom anymore. So that these two groups, none and some, are quite similar in their relationships in positive environments, which looks more like that Diathesis-Stress Model that doesn't hypothesize a difference in the way that people respond in positive environments. But where we see that difference is for people who had highly positive childhoods. So these people are changing less in response to increases and decreases in the stress in their environment. Their psychopathology is responding less in those situations compared to the other groups of people. And so that is a buffering effect. That's the opposite of making someone differentially susceptible. It's making someone less, obviously we can't make causal inferences here, but it is associated with being less responsive to changes in the environment, having a highly positive environment. Is that clear for everyone? And so basically the key point here is that both of these effects are happening at the same time. I think that that's an important thing to think about, so that the interaction that we're seeing for childhood adversity as a differential susceptibility factor is independent of people's positive childhood experiences, and vice versa. The effect of the positive childhood experiences is independent of the effects of childhood adversity. And that's important because what we're seeing is that at the same time as childhood adversity is a differential susceptibility factor, we're seeing positive childhood as a buffering factor, making people less sensitive to changes in the environment. Let me just think if there was anything else that I wanted to say here. Yeah, so I guess that the other thing that I would reiterate, because the next section is talking about limitations of these analyses, is that really what I think that is cool about these results is that these are the same data that McLaughlin et al. Analyzed in their analyses, and they found results that strongly support a diathesis-stress sort of model, where higher levels of childhood adversity interact with higher levels of adulthood stress to predict higher levels of psychopathology. And those patterns are in these data, but what we did is by looking at change between the two waves, we were able to look at sensitivity to that change. So we could look at how change in the level of stress in the environment predicted change in the level of psychopathology that adults were manifesting. And so this, I guess, leads into the limitations where these are imperfect analyses at this point, but I think that a good initial way to get at the key research questions that we're interested in. There's a pretty substantial literature on the unreliability of change scores as independent and dependent variables, but that's why I emphasize that I think in this case they're very well suited to the research question that we're interested in and give us a unique perspective on these data. Also, when, for example, Justin was introducing the Diathesis-Stress Model, it really talks about people having positive outcomes and the effects of a positive environment. And we didn't operationalize positive outcomes as such or a positive environment as such, so much as increases and decreases in change and psychopathology. And so I think that that's a gap for other studies to be able to address, to explicitly look at these results in adults. in actual positive environments and operationalizing that thriving idea. And my Excel skills are also one of the limitations, because I would have liked to have given you error bars to interpret those effects as we went through. So that's the summary of the results, and I'll hand over to Sophia to take you through how we understand them in the context of the literature.
Thank you, Miriam and Justin. So before I go into a discussion of the significance of our findings and hopefully convince you that our results demonstrate the importance of thinking beyond diathesis stress, I'd like to return to our original question and quickly review the models that Justin described and which sort of spurred these research questions. So in this study, we sought to examine how repeated or chronic childhood adversity shapes mental health and environmental sensitivity as it's observed in adulthood. This study grew out of lingering questions that we had about the now well-established diathesis-stress model. To review, according to this theory, particularly vulnerable individuals are noted to do exceptionally poorly under stressful conditions. Let me see if I can use the cursor. So right here. Often this is evidenced by elevated rates in psychopathology. These same individuals, however, when placed into positive environments, are hypothesized to be indistinguishable from their more resilient peers. We, as well as a number of groups, took an evolutionary perspective and questioned, why is it that natural selection would have favored organisms that by default respond to chronic adversity by becoming dysfunctional or dysregulated? Ultimately, this question of evolutionary purpose of an organism with heightened stress responsivity led to the discovery of differential susceptibility, in which individuals are conceptualized not so much as vulnerable and resilient, but rather as more or less sensitive or to their environment. So in this model, we find that certain fixed individuals, what previously we would have thought of as being resilient, are actually just sort of less responsive to their environment, to the extent that when presented with a negative environment, they do quite effectively the same in terms of psychopathology or whatever outcome you're measuring as they would when placed into a positive environment. What we see with a differentially susceptible individual, someone who responds in both a for worse and a for better manner, is that when we put them into negative contexts, they do admittedly poorly. But strikingly, and I think really amazingly with this model, when placed into supportive environments, they actually have outcomes that exceed those of their less malleable peers. So this model of differential susceptibility was elaborated by Tom Boyce, who suggested that childhood experiences, here represented by E1, can actually in and of themselves be differential susceptibility promoting factors. So this model here states that early environments, as E1, shape a more or less sensitive phenotype via an early conditional adaptation. This differentially susceptible phenotype, thus, interacts with later environments, like could be found in adulthood, to determine developmental and health outcomes in a biology by context type of interaction. We found this model quite compelling in terms of answering our research questions. And so what we did is we took it but adapted it. So instead of having a biologically reactive phenotype like Boyce uses, we had here instead a mental health or a behaviorally reactive individual as the phenotype of interest. And what we indeed found was that when individuals are placed under conditions of highly stressful childhoods, they develop this sensitive phenotype that makes them much more reactive in a for better and for worse manner to changes in their environmental stressors. Somewhat surprisingly, with regard to childhood support, we found that contrary to actually what we may have expected, childhood support isn't simply the inverse of childhood adversity, such that the absence of having a supportive environment causes you to become differentially susceptible. Rather, it looks like childhood support in and of itself acts as a buffer and serves to push people back into a less reactive type of phenotype in response to their changes in environmental stressors. So before discussing the significance of a result, I'd like us to take a step back and think about how stress responsivity might be considered from an evolutionary perspective. Indeed, the stress response system has evolved to equip an organism with a set of responses that enable it to effectively respond and adapt to different environmental contexts, thereby promoting both the survival of an individual as well as the greater survival of the species. From this perspective, what constitutes an optimal strategy in a given environment may actually prove detrimental to the fitness of that organism if placed in a different set of ecological circumstances. As a result, natural selection would favor the development of adaptive plasticity, or the capacity of an organism to support a diversity of stress-responsive phenotypes in response to a range of ecological conditions. This ability, thus, to adapt to a diverse environmental conditions would maximize the likelihood of survival and ultimately also of reproductive success. The development of alternative phenotypes is often guided by environmental cues found in an organism's environment and does so in a process that we consider or we call conditional adaptation. Often cues found in the early environment can actually provide information predicting conditions of the organism they will be likely to encounter as an adult. When a plastic phenotype is informed by these early cues, but its benefits are only accrued at later phases of the life cycle, this process can be described as a predictive adaptive response. In a predictive adaptive response, early cues are employed to adjust the developmental trajectories to match the individual's forecasted needs. From this perspective, many putatively maladaptive traits, such as anxiety, aggression, or even impulsivity, can be reframed as admittedly costly, but nevertheless adaptive phenotypes that improve an individual's likelihood of surviving in hostile and unpredictable contexts. So, for example, we could think of someone with symptoms of increased vigilance and anxiety and how these could be regarded as defensive reactions to potential threats when one is confronted with an environment that is rife with predators, as might be found, for example, in a household in which a child is subject to repeated exposures to significant violence. Similarly, increased anxiety or emotional reactivity could make an individual more open or more capable of capitalizing on positive or nourishing experiences that might actually be scarce in certain types of environment, like would occur with situations of childhood neglect. In general, we can say that many psychopathological responses may be recast as adaptive in unfortunate circumstances, insofar as they would increase one's ability to survive. And so, indeed, this is what we found, what we believe that we have suggested by our results. So let me again orient you to this model. So what we have here on the x-axis is our independent variable, the adult environment that we conceptualize as a change in environmental stressors. On our y-axis, we have our dependent variable or adult outcome, which we've conceptualized as change in psychopathology. And what we indeed found is that when you look at individuals who are subjected to high levels of a negative childhood environment, that high childhood adversity does seem to be associated with a more sensitive environment or a sensitive phenotype, such that when placed under negative conditions, these individuals are noted to do exceptionally poorly. But sort of interestingly, when placed in supportive environments, they do significantly better than their less malleable counterparts. Similarly, for positive childhood environments, we found actually that high levels of childhood support acts not as the inverse of childhood adversity, but rather as its own sort of buffering effect, such that it puts people into a less reactive sort of phenotype where they are less likely to respond substantially either to negative or positive environmental factors. So these findings, we think, have sort of long-ranging implications, not only in terms of childhood interventions, but also for interventions in adulthood. Indeed, we think that these results really attest to the importance of early intervention programs, such as Head Start or programs that would cultivate a parent's ability to create a nourishing environment for their child. In this sense, in the face of childhood adversity, we may say that there will be amplified or exaggerated benefit to be gained by establishing a supportive environment, perhaps even to the extent that it may neutralize some of the detriments that are observed for children that are subject to significant adversity. Similarly, in the adult environment, there are also opportunities for interventions. Indeed, interventions that focus on improving environmental conditions may be particularly beneficial in individuals with a history of significant childhood adversity. Similarly, interventions aimed at maybe modulating an adult's reactivity to stress, like would be found in interventions like mindfulness, may also be particularly beneficial. Although this data set did not provide us with the opportunity to analyze stress sensitizing biomarkers, collecting information of putative plasticity genotypes could enable us to further potentially separate out these sensitive genotypes and thus demonstrate a stronger or amplified effect of sensitivity to the environment. Along another line, recognition of context-sensitive phenotypes that may be engendered by high levels of childhood adversity may explain some of the elevated placebo effects that we find in intervention research. Indeed, by recognizing that childhood adversity may catalyze sort of a more environmentally sensitive effect of childhood, we could sort of see how individuals thus who are put into regular contact with individuals and maybe have a more structured environment, as would be the case when you participate in an intervention study, would be exacting substantial gains independent of whatever the intervention is trying to test. So in this sense, perhaps controlling for childhood adversity in these studies may help to sort of bring out an effect when one is expecting one. Finally, although we all dream about a time when we will have information about biomarker or gene tests that tell us about whether or not an individual is likely or not likely to respond to an intervention, what we're showing here is that a series of very simple questions regarding the individual's childhood experiences can give us a significant amount of information on the types of interventions that may be particularly well suited to this individual. So I'd like to leave you with some considerations for how we might think beyond diathesis stress with a greater mind to evolutionary or functional models of adversity and how they impinge on developmental trajectories for managing stress. The Diathesis-Stress Model is, at its core, a disease model. It has been productive in generating a large level of empirical evidence of the myriad ways that adversity strains individuals that are susceptible to the effects of stress. This fact is incontrovertible, and we're not trying to suggest that the Diathesis-Stress Model does not have legitimacy. The message we hope, however, that you're going to take away from this presentation is the idea that by focusing on dysfunction, this model tells only half of the story. The other half of the story concerns the functional or adaptive individual differences that can occur in response to different ecological demands. Indeed, our results demonstrate that a coherent alternative response to adversity occurs in a sizable proportion of the population, which enables the very same individuals who are most negatively affected by the environment to simultaneously also reap the benefits when placed into more supportive contexts. Research, thus, is urgently needed to recover a high-resolution map of the range of functional adaptations, to identify the specific social and environmental factors and that shape the expression, and to trace the onset course and sensitive periods for this change. It is only after this knowledge has been gained that we'll be able to better understand whether the goal of our interventions should be to work with functional adaptation, or, as we've already been doing, whether we need to intervene against them. So in conclusion, this is the first analysis to identify a childhood adversity and childhood support as differential susceptibility factors that are manifest and measured in adulthood. Evidence that heightened responsivity to stress also has been shown to extend across psychopathology and not be just situated in those types of diagnoses that are thought to be more concerned with stress reactivity. And in this sense, we could say that these differential susceptibility factors really are transdiagnostic. These findings highlight opportunities for the development of novel approaches, perhaps that focus on the environment, to treat and extend our way of looking at these individuals beyond diathesis stress. Thank you. Questions?
So we'll save your questions for just a moment. Just a few thoughts. It really was an excellent presentation, guys. Thank you very much. I had not seen it before, so I got to experience it along with all of you guys for the first time. I mean, there were a lot of excellent things that leaped out at me. The analytic approach was deceptively sophisticated in many ways. I thought that looking at stress in a way as a latent variable allowed those to be represented simply, but it requires a kind of a complex approach to the problem to do this. To do it prospectively, I also thought was kind of unique. I've rarely actually seen prospective latent variables examined and ensuring that they are consistent across the time points. Again, a lot of sophisticated data analytic responses. I was very impressed that you guys focused on positive things. So typically we would see these kinds of data examined only from a pathology standpoint. So that was really very positive. I thought you guys were extremely erudite, I think, in how you approach this in interpreting the results. Bringing in evolutionary thinking was really a nice touch. I don't see this very often, but I thought it was done very well and very appropriately. I sort of see the science that you brought here a little bit catching up with what I consider psychotherapeutic wisdom that has been around a long time, that has not had the sort of symbol of science around it that would support it. These are things that how childhood experiences affect adulthood. So psychoanalysts and the people that came from that based on dynamic therapy are constantly focused on this, and we CBT science types go, where does that come from, and how do you know, and all this, and the science is maybe catching up with that wisdom in many ways. Another idea from sort of our collective past and our collective wisdom is that a lot of times people are adapting to pathological responses early in their lives, and that when we start seeing pathology, they're carrying forward those essentially adaptive responses into a time when they're no longer adaptive or necessarily needed. And so that again was some old style psychotherapeutic wisdom that I think you guys have allowed us to understand from a scientific standpoint. A question that I had, and then I'm going to open up for others that might have questions, but I'll start with one that I had. So when we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, or I think standard therapies, and maybe I'll address this to you, Sophia, since you're the clinician in the trio, the damage is already done in many respects. So you've made it clear that these positive environments can really help. Obviously, we want to minimize the stressful situations, but we see patients in adulthood that have these maladaptive responses. And I wonder if you have any sense of the capacity to, through like a cognitive behavioral process or perhaps pharmacology, to modify those kinds of responses. And there's some hints of that in your data, it seems like, because by making the environment more positive, is there plasticity in these? And I'm going to actually invite you guys to step up and get the questions, but maybe Sophia, you can comment on that one to start.
So thanks, Matt. I think that's an interesting question. I think one of the things that our data hopefully show is that this idea that individuals are more or less malleable and sort of plastic towards their environment. And in that sense, I guess could think of interventions as being something that maybe could go along with some of the functional adaptations that they have had. So I think the whole Diathesis-Stress Model seems to suggest that we just need to intervene and make people the same as more resilient types. And maybe if we were to sort of think more along the lines of sort of going with what some of their functionally adaptive styles of thinking might be and think about ways to sort of change with those, then maybe we might have some more, better effective treatments.
Can I add something?
Yep.
I'm not a clinician, but one of the things that I think is pretty cool about these results is that we're observing them in adulthood. So the effects of the childhood environment is not proximal to where we're observing this sensitivity environment. And so I think that speaks to some really interesting intervention possibilities, that these people are more sensitive to changes in their environment in adulthood, regardless of what happened in their childhood. Like, sure, it's great if in childhood we can have interventions to create this highly positive childhood environment that buffers the effects of childhood adversity. But I think that part of how I think about it in terms of in the clinic is that these people would be more susceptible to the positive changes that therapy can affect. So focusing on making those changes in the environment, we would expect them to have bigger gains in response to that.
I'll add one thing. Cool. I'm also not a clinician, But I think how this might relate to CBT is that patients that would be more vulnerable to high sensitivity to their environment and stress reactivity could potentially be a kind of behavioral therapy that focuses on stress coping skills potentially to decrease the reactivity. Stress reactivity could potentially be something that could be used in the clinic, and that's something that we touched on in our talk.
So this is what I saw is your big contribution on the same data set that McLaughlin did is looking at this change aspect and things like that, which I think is a great analytical strategy. Now, I may have missed something in this part in terms of the analysis part, but you were just, I think there was this part about the childhood adversity piece that you could quantify in terms of number, and then there was the, which I think resulted in a change. When I'm looking at the graph here, it resulted, from the, but with fewer things, a change in slope, a more positive slope, right?
Childhood adversity, was it?
Childhood adversity. I think if we went back, yep. Or even take it to the Cordis summary slide more forward.
Yeah, that's
okay?
a good idea.
Okay, because that makes it a little easier for me to. These are ones that
the models?
The models piece is kind of the simplistic model perspective. Okay, so this is for.
This is differential susceptibility.
This is differential susceptibility, but you were showing the things about where you show where there's increase and you show the tilt. Okay, so this is higher childhood severity, increases the slope, okay? And then the next slide, I believe, was the positive higher childhood support decreases that. But you did the analysis separately for high childhood support and adversity.
So those analyses, the variables, they were in at the same time. So
They're in at the same time.
There's
and so
simultaneous independent effects of one another, which is pretty cool. Because it's not just the absence of a positive childhood being childhood adversity. It's childhood adversity contributes over and above the effects of the positive childhood experiences and vice versa, that they're independent simultaneous effects in the models.
I guess that's what I had, this is just my own personal experience of looking at the data. That's what those are the words you say, but I didn't have an intuitive feel of how that worked. Okay, and not that it's your, that may be my problem, okay? But it's because when you said like 70% of the children had what percentage had?
70% had all of the positive childhood experiences.
Right.
Yeah.
And what percent had the greater than 3? That
20%
was
childhood adversity. Yeah.
20%. So is there much overlap between those two populations?
I couldn't quantify it for you off the top of my head, but I would say inevitably, because the large majority of the sample had all of the positive childhood factors. I think that a lot of the people, there's a mix of childhood adversity within that sample because of the distribution of childhood adversity that we saw. And so one of the things, we practiced this talk yesterday, and one of the new T32s suggested, why don't you plot that additive effect? Show what happens when you have low childhood adversity and low and high positive childhood and vice versa, to show how they add together. And I should have done that in retrospect, but Excel is really hard, Kelvin.
Well, that was going to be my next point. I was going to help you with that piece, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And so, but basically what we see is that they have an additive effect to one another. So if we look at that summary slide that shows...
That's kind of what I would be...
Yeah. So here, what we're seeing is that this effect here adds to this effect here. So we would expect people who have all of the positive childhood factors and none of the childhood adversity factors to have an even less susceptible pattern to changes in the environment. And potentially, if we had people with the absence of positive childhood and the presence of high childhood adversity, we would see an amplifying effect, particularly in negative environments, we would see that. But in positive environments, we see that it flattens off more. It doesn't have that same differential susceptibility piece.
I agree you need the ultimate graph for this because it's such a powerful and complex idea that with
Yeah.
the right graph, I would get it.
Yeah.
But the answer is Excel is not the answer.
Oh.
R is the answer.
Yeah. R's
R.
even harder than Excel.
No, but you're ready for the next level. I can
Yeah,
tell.
sure.
You want, because the complexity of this data requires
You're right.
that.
Yeah, and we're going to reanalyze and we will make sure that we have clear visual representations of these effects. This is our first pass
Oh,
at
it's
looking
cool.
at the patterns in the
You're going to have a
data.
gorgeous graph with R.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I would love to hear your thoughts on how this ties to some of the literature on differential susceptibility of individuals with different genetic makeups, particularly in relationship to the serotonin gene, transporter gene, the short allele and the long allele.
Yeah, so most of these, actually, so the question of differential susceptibility has really been most, I think, focused on gene environment types of reactions, or interactions, sorry. And what we thought with our study, what we sought to do was to sort of see if we could look at this at the phenotypic level and not just in stratifying people by genes. Because there's a lot of data that suggests that there are these sort of sensitizing alleles such that people with, I think there's a COMT gene, there's a serotonin gene, there's even the FKBP5, which is a glucocorticoid receptor gene, that you find within those, you're able to sort of stratify people based on their relative or sensitivity to their environment. What we're showing here is that at a population level, independent of having those specific gene effects, that we can even see this phenotype, grossly. And no one has really shown that yet. Most of the data is sort of, if we look at depression in this particular gene, that's just what we find the effect. And we're actually seeing this at a population level, which is what we think is really cool.
Can I add?
Yes.
Just to add to that, and that may be a little oversimplistic, but what do you think about those individuals that are more highly susceptible using an SSRI? Is it potentially making them less susceptible to stress and maybe positive effects of the environment as well?
So I've often wondered about this too, and I haven't come to a conclusion, but it's this idea, so what happens when we use medications? Are they environmental, altering types of things? You could sort of see them as altering the sort of biochemical environment in an individual. I don't have a good answer on what exactly we might expect for that, but it's an interesting, and I think probably an important question to ask.
I would just add as well that I think that the literature on the sensitive genotype is really relevant, and my hypothesis would be that we would see stronger effects if we could take into account not only what sensitizing experiences of people had, but also in the presence of a sensitive genotype that we might see even stronger effects in those people. So I think if there were the data available to stratify people both by their genotypic markers that highlight that differential susceptibility as well as their experiences that might make them differentially susceptible, we'd see even further interactions.
I believe the NESARC probably has data on who is on what drug. It might be interesting, we wouldn't get exactly at this, but would, for example, these relationships of adversity and positive childhood, would that be different if you were on an SSRI versus not? Something you
Sure. That was going to be my question. This is, you have tons of data there. It's an epidemiologic sample. And so did you ever look at who are the people who had interventions and what kinds of interventions, and did the response differ depending upon this stratification you have for your model?
We have not looked at that. What we're kind of excited about, at least with this model, is that it really does raise just, a lot of different questions that we could look at using it as a model. But that isn't specifically a question that we have not addressed.
And also in terms of psychopathology, how they panned out, stratified in terms of diagnosis. I saw a very minute sample bearing the diagnostic label of PTSD. There was a bigger sample with depression.
Now this is our doc, so we're not supposed to think about diagnoses. We haven't actually separated it out by diagnosis, but we thought that using sort of the internalizing, externalizing spectra was a way to sort of get at those latent variables.
That was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you know if there are similar results in animal models?
Yeah.
once maybe repeat, are there similar results in animal models?
Yes.
With the changes, not just, I know, the monkey and the wireframe monkey experiments with the rhesus macaques, but are there have similar things been seen with differential reactivity in animal models?
I think there are. To be honest, I'm not that familiar with the animal literature. I know that it has been looked at in those in those contexts. Yeah, I'm just not that. But I would assume that we would see a similar type of effect. It would be a little bit different because we wouldn't be looking at psychopathology outcomes. And let me also add that I think that probably certain systems may represent a form of differential susceptibility and sort of be catalysts of this heightened plasticity to one's environment. But I also think that there are probably systems that may actually react in a more diathesis-stress type of manner where you don't necessarily see improvement when placed into sort of positive conditions. I think what's exciting about this area and sort of thinking about looking at the whole spectrum of environmental sort of inputs is that we can start to tease out what are the mechanisms for plasticity and what really aren't.
When you write this paper up, which I'm sure you will soon.
Yes, we will.
There may be, animal literature may be a place to, in the discussion, I would think, you're going to have limited genetic variability with an animal model, and it might help speak to, how the adversity or the positive experiences, which I don't know if it's been done, but it could be modeled in animals, given limited genetic variability, how that plays out. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to our speakers again.
Should we stay?
Great job. Great job. We have expectations next year.
I know.
You have been